A rabbi has the responsibility to speak about the most important events of the day. So yes, I'm going to speak about the election tonight. On this night especially, we are supposed to take an honest and serious look at ourselves, at our lives. And it's incumbent upon us to consider the presidential race in the context of Judaism, of our values and our priorities. I know that most of us have made up our minds. At the same time, there are moral aspects to this election that extend far beyond what has been written and spoken in other settings. The presidential race prompts several important Jewish questions that I would like to address this evening. The first question: should a synagogue have a voice in politics? And if so, what should it be? Many would argue that politics has no place in a synagogue, and they're right. A rabbi should never tell his congregation who to vote for. It's inappropriate for clergy to use the influence of religion and their purported understanding of God's will to dictate what their congregants should do when they enter the voting booth. Equally important, we also believe strongly in the separation of church and state that's enshrined in the First Amendment. One essential aspect of that separation is the tax-exempt status granted to all houses of worship. To endorse a candidate in any election would be to put our tax-exempt status in jeopardy, and it would violate the boundary between church and state that we hold sacred. Now, some churches and synagogues in certain neighborhoods may come perilously close to this line, and sometimes they cross it altogether, but I can assure you that as long as I am rabbi here at Temple Israel, you will never hear me endorse any candidate from this bima. So for all these reasons and more, a synagogue should not be a place of politics, but it absolutely must be a place of principles and values. So that's what we'll focus on: the principles and values that are at stake both today and down the line. Our Torah portion for tomorrow morning, for Yom Kippur morning, speaks about the choices we make and what's at stake for us. Deuteronomy says, "I call heaven and earth to witness this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing or curse. Choose life, therefore, that you and your descendants may live." Well, when God puts it in those black and white terms, the choice is easy. So too, there are many of us here who find it easy to stand squarely behind one candidate or the other. But I also know that there are many here tonight who are not enamored of either of the major party candidates. Some of you have said to me, "I just can't vote for either of them." And so that brings us to our second question of the evening. What's the Jewish thing to do when faced with two difficult options? Some commentators on this current election have quoted Charles Spurgeon, who said, "Of two evils, choose neither." That is certainly a principled stand. However, Spurgeon had the good fortune of being a 19th century upper-class Englishman. His being and his nation were completely secure. So maybe he had the luxury of sitting it out. We Jews haven't always been so lucky. In fact, throughout most of our history, we Jews have had few good options at all. In pre-modern times, our lives were severely limited. The ruler of wherever we lived defined where we could call home, what schools we could attend, what jobs we could hold, even who we could marry. And then in the modern world, we've often been faced with unpleasant choices too. Some of us, or our ancestors, were forced to choose between enduring persecution at home or facing uncertainty by traveling to a new foreign land. Some of us or our ancestors were forced to choose between living openly as Jews and thus facing social limitations, or concealing our Jewishness in order to advance in society. Philosopher Isaiah Berlin explored the nature of difficult choices. Life is full of agonizing alternatives, he wrote. We are doomed to choose, and every choice may entail an irreparable loss. How do we choose between possibilities? Priorities must be established. In a choice between two good options, we must necessarily sacrifice certain values for others that are of higher importance. Thus, the inverse is also true. In a choice between two difficult options, we might do well to choose the one that forces us to sacrifice the fewest of our values. So let us consider what values are in play. The third question of the evening: what exactly is at stake? We all know what each candidate has proposed or promised regarding domestic or foreign policy, but a consideration of what's at stake extends far beyond the policy decisions that the next president will or will not make. Quite simply, the President of the United States is the most visible human being on earth. The President's words and behavior are broadcast instantaneously around the world, and they reverberate powerfully. On Erev Rosh Hashanah, I commented that politicians had long ceased to be moral exemplars for us, and many of you laughed. But that statement wasn't intended to be comic, it was intended to be tragic. I would ask those of us here tonight who grew up in the United States to think back. Think back to who was president when you were starting elementary school, or perhaps when you were 6 or 7 years old. Whoever it was, I'm guessing that to some degree you looked up to him. Regardless of whether your parents voted for him or whether he is remembered today as a good president or not, your emerging worldview was somehow shaped by that president. Like it or not, the President of the United States is someone our children will inevitably look up to. Like it or not, we all, no matter our age, rely on the character of the president. And like it or not, our president defines who we are, how we see ourselves, and the tenor of our public dialogue. So I ask you, what do we want our youngest and most impressionable to see and hear? What conversations do we want to have when we sit down at the dinner table with our children or our grandchildren? We have seen what happens when a president commits a crime in order to get reelected. We have seen what happens when a president has an affair in the Oval Office. And we have seen what happens when a president commits the United States to military action overseas on grounds that are flimsy at best. So over the next 4 years, rather than talking about income tax evasion, wouldn't we prefer to talk about how to ensure that all workers can earn a decent living? Rather than talking about sexual advances, wouldn't we prefer to talk about how to keep our country and the state of Israel secure in a world of uncertainty and instability? And rather than talking about who we will exclude from our country, wouldn't we prefer to talk about how we can create a nation that fulfills its promise of life, liberty, and happiness for all its citizens? All of this is what's at stake. The priorities we'll pursue as a nation, the leader our children and grandchildren will look to as a model, the tenor of our public conversation in our homes, our schools, our places of work, and yes, our synagogues. our priorities, and our public conversation are so critically important at this time. We're all disappointed by the ways in which we see that our nation is not moving in the right direction. Gaps between wealthy and poor have widened. Racial fault lines have emerged. Our standing in the world has declined. And we're concerned about our children's future. And so we ask the final, fourth question of this evening. Who will get us back on track? Who will solve the challenges we face? My mentor, Rabbi Peter Rubenstein, taught me an important lesson. 8 years ago, he noted the enthusiasm that Barack Obama's campaign generated, and he warned, beware of false prophets. It was not that Rabbi Rubenstein disliked President Obama. Rather, he was skeptical of any person who claimed that he or she alone could solve all of our problems or who was held up as a savior. In fact, we Jews have been warned time and again about false prophets. Deuteronomy says, if a prophet appears among you and announces to you miracles and wonders, you must not listen. It is the Lord your God alone you must follow and revere. Yet, time and again, we Jews have fallen for false prophecy. In the 2nd century, a man named Simon Bar Kokhba was hailed as the Messiah as he led a doomed revolt against Rome. And in the 17th century, a charismatic figure known as Shabtai Tzvi arose in Turkey. He was ultimately arrested by the Ottoman authorities. He converted to Islam, and he left his followers, the downtrodden Jews of Eastern Europe, utterly disappointed. Yes, Jewish history is littered with tales of false prophets, self-proclaimed messiahs, each of whom promised to solve all of our problems, and each of whom came to naught. So who will be the Messiah for us? A story. One day, Rabbi Joshua ben Levi, a great sage of his generation, happened to meet the prophet Elijah along the way. Now, Rabbi Joshua knew that in our tradition, Elijah will one day accompany the Messiah. And so you can imagine that Rabbi Joshua got pretty excited. He asked Elijah, when will the Messiah come? Elijah said, well, you can go and ask him yourself. Joshua asked, well, where is he and how will I recognize him? Elijah said, he is sitting among the poor lepers at the gate to the city, tending to their bandages one by one. Our Savior is found not in grand pronouncements or promises. Rather, the Messiah is found among the lepers, the lowest of the low, the untouchables of their day, healing their wounds one by one, face to face. For us, the Messianic era begins not in sweeping initiatives of leadership, but in anonymous deeds of mercy and compassion. So on the one hand, we know that the choice we make on November 8th will help define who and what we are. More than the various policies our nation will pursue, our choice on November 8th will define the tenor of our public discourse and the role model we provide for our children. And at the same time, we know that the choice we make on November 8th is far less important than the choices we make every day. Our new president will not solve all the challenges that we observe in our nation. Only we can do that, person to person, day by day. With God's help, may it be so. Ken Yehi Ratzon.